Chapter 10, Language. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at the words that you use, and keep in mind that every word you use has power to it. We will define language and related terms, explain how language is used for power, explain how language choices affect the effectiveness of public speaking, how they must meet a standard of clarity, how to choose appropriate language for your audience, and begin to develop your own language ability in speaking. Language is any formal system of gestures, signs, sounds, and symbols. It's used or conceived as a means of communicating thought, either through written, enacted, or spoken means. Most use of language is spoken or oral. Written language and spoken language differs in several ways. So let's look at the study of language. Words do not have meaning themselves, the meaning resides in the person using them. Language is not just something we use, it's a part of who we are, it's a part of us. It's extremely difficult to separate language from thinking, and languages is affected by power and powerful people, and it also affects power. So examples of language use. So the using euphemisms to hide meaning. So a euphemism is typically when we take a word that's a little harsh and we substitute it with something that's less harsh. So consider that a company that is firing people or making cuts, they may call it downsizing instead of saying we are firing people. The denotative versus the connotative meaning of a word. The denotative is the dictionary definition of a word. The connotative is the feelings or emotions you have associated with that word. And sometimes we can have miscommunication because of conflicts there. I'll give you an example of that. Years ago, it was actually not long after September 11th. 2001. It was March of 2002. My friend and I were in New York for a trip, and we were in a cab, and as we were driving down the road or in Manhattan, we saw that a school had been evacuated. And the cab driver said, yes, we have things like this that happen all the time. There are threats made, things are evacuated. This is happening all the time. And he said, we need a regime change in this country. And my friend and I both looked at each other and talked later that we did not care for that term when it was used to describe the American government. But when you look up the definition of regime, it says a government, comma, especially an authoritarian one. But it doesn't say exclusively an authoritarian one. But I think typically we've only ever heard that word used with authoritarian governments. So when he used that term to describe the United States government, it really hit us both the wrong way. But in reality, he wasn't far from the denotative dictionary definition of the word. It just impacted our emotional attachment to the word, and there's the connotative meaning. So, ethical language. When we communicate, we need to make sure we're being respectful of others, respect the freedom of thought, informed decision making. And so, there's standards for language and public speaking. And we're going to look at each of these in more detail as we continue. The first one is clarity. So, abstract versus concrete. Too abstract, everyone has a different meaning. Too concrete, everyone, it's too specific, and some people may not share the same meaning. And let me get this pulled up so that you guys can see it. Some people may not know the reference that people are using. So we want to make sure that our language is more concrete than abstract, but that we are sharing the same meaning. The right word, lightning versus lightning bug, making sure that we're using specific language so that the audience knows exactly what we're talking about. Familiarity, that we're using language that's familiar to the audience. Literal versus figurative language. So think about ways that you can make things more clear to your audience, things like metaphors, similes, to really paint a picture so that your audience can see, feel exactly what you're talking about. Effectiveness, language should be a means of inclusion and connection and not exclusion. In saying that, avoid jargon and avoid slang. Make sure that the words that you're using are not overly or under complicated that your audience is feeling excluded by your message. Avoid complicated vocabulary when simple words will do. And always avoid profanity or cursing unless, of course, you're in a comedy club where that is allowed. So the ladder of abstraction. This gives you kind of a visual of abstract language. So when you think of art, that's one of the most abstract things we can think of. If you were to ask 20 people what art is, you're probably going to get 20 answers. If you're going to ask 20 people what art looks like, you're probably going to get 20 different answers. So when talking about art, how can you take the most abstract thing to the most concrete? So if you look at this ladder, it goes through the process of art, the most abstract term, to visual art, three-dimensional art, sculpture, marble sculpture, Baroque sculpture, to the sculpture of Bernini's David. So this is an example of how you can take the most abstract to the most concrete. Next, we'll look at rhetorical techniques. Assonance, pie in the sky, by and by, when you die. So it's when the sounding of the words sticks with your audience. Alliteration, the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew. Antithesis, integrity without knowledge is weak and useless, and knowledge without integrity is dangerous and dreadful. Parallelism, I came, I saw, I conquered. When the words and the way that you're saying them is pleasing to the ear of the audience, then it's going to add more memorability to your message because the way it sounded was pleasing to them. More rhetorical techniques. Anaphora, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Hyperbole, exaggeration just for the effect of exaggeration. Irony, the roasted chicken was as tender as a leather boot. And there are many, many other type of rhetorical techniques that you can use to make sure that your audience gets the impact of your message, and it also helps it stick to their memory a little bit better. Appropriateness, make sure to use gender inclusive language. Avoid generic he, refer to humans, not men. Avoid gender typing jobs or roles. Ethnic identity, use only if necessary, and it's usually not necessarily to do that. Be equal, use correct terms, Asian, not Oriental, of course. So make sure that the language that you're using are both gender and ethnic inclusive. References to disability, use only if relevant, and again, it's generally not relevant. Use correct terms and do not totalize. And always refer to audience and context when it comes to appropriateness. So, ways to develop your language abilities. Use stipulated definitions at the beginning of a speech when it's appropriate. Use personal pronouns. Build your vocabulary, but don't inflict it on others. Just because you've learned a new word that's really long and complicated doesn't necessarily mean you need to include it in your presentations. Your language should be professional, but it should also be very easy to hear, follow, and understand. So, more to consider. What are some of the cliches and slang that have become popular recently? What do they mean? Why would they not be useful in public speaking? As a class, looked at Banned Words website by Lake Superior State University. Listen to a presidential speech, such as the inaugural address, and study it for figurative language, similes, rhetorical techniques, etc., to think of ways to use words to build and reflect the power of the presidency as well as connect with the audience. I would say, looking back at Ronald Reagan's speeches, to me, are some of the best to look at figurative language and the use of figurative language. Many of his speeches have a lot of impact because of his speechwriter and because he used beautiful language in many of his speeches. I hope this helps. Remember, as you're picking your words and you're writing your speeches, everything you say has power and it has impact. How are you going to use your words to impact your audience and to make a change maybe in our class and as you go forth in our world?